My name is Malika Fourie and I will be your host. As always, we are delighted to have so many of you, both local and international, join us for this webinar. And if you wish, you're very welcome to also introduce yourselves using the chat function. It's always for us, not good for us, but also for you as the audience. It's good to know who's here with us today. So the theme of today's very timely and important webinar is Anthro History, Crises and Futures. We have three distinguished guests on our panel who also in a way represent three distinct voices or perspectives on this topic. So in this webinar, Emery, Kalema, Shaheed, Tayob and Mosa Phadi will reflect on the various political and environmental crises that are playing out internationally, including the pandemics of racial violence, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, gender-based violence, and also COVID-19, and the role of history and anthropology as disciplines and methods that may aid our understanding of these crises. Specifically, their discussion will be framed by the potential contribution these disciplines can make towards charting out a different and more hopeful future. So our roadmap for the webinar is as follows. We are going to start off with my colleague, Dr. Emery Kalema, who also put together the details for today's webinar. I believe Emery will speak to our topics through the lens of history as discipline. I will then hand over to Shaheed Tayob, who will speak from an anthropological perspective. And finally, Dr. Mosa Phadi, a sociologist, will act as respondent to their talks. We hope to end off with an interactive discussion between these panelists before addressing questions from you as the audience. So Emery Kalema is a researcher in studies in historical trauma and transformation at Stellenbosch University. He holds a PhD in history from the University of the Witwatersrand. Kalema was a summer program and social science fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in 2018 to 2019, and the winner of the competition for the inaugural Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora Research Fellowship at New York University in the fall of 2019. Emery's research interests include power and politics, body and embodiment, violence, memory, trauma, and suffering. He has published in international peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of African History. Emery, we very much look forward to hearing from you now. Just one last thing before I hand over to Emery, I want to mention to you as the audience that you should please post your questions or reflections in response to this panel discussion using the Q&A function. And I also want to ask you to please do so already during our discussion. Don't wait until the end. We should have at least 20 minutes to address these questions from the audience. So Emery, with that, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Melike, for the introduction. Let me start with our two historians, Mark Bloch and John Scott, envisioned the role of history as a discipline. They both wrote in a time when the world was experiencing tumultuous and changing events, the Second World War in the case of Mark Bloch, and the 2007 financial crisis in the case of John Scott. In his book, The Historian's Craft, Bloch writes that history is neither watchmaking nor cabinet construction. It is an endeavor toward better understanding. So an endeavor toward better understanding, that's what Bloch understood to be first and foremost the role of history. And I believe this could apply to our time as well. So history as a quest for knowing and understanding our time. John Scott, on the contrary, sees things quite differently. In her book chapter titled History Writing as Critique, she defines history as critique, the point of which is to open possibility for thinking and so acting differently, and in this way to remain open to the future. This leads me to postulate that there is something useful and intellectually stimulating in reading the past in relation to the present, and that this kind of reading can open a set of possibilities for thinking about the future. I will quickly reflect on this while taking the idea of crisis as my point of departure. Now, let us take as an example that societies describe a set of events as crises: climate crisis, gender-based violence crisis, Black Lives Matter crisis, coronavirus crisis, or genocide crisis, and that they do it at a time that they are living. They use the language of crisis as they are living. They look for patterns, for explanatory tools. My PhD thesis was on trying to understand how events that took place in the 1960s have a link to events before, but also how they create a set of shadows and echoes that go all the way through the 1990s and 2000. In structuring my dissertation, I didn't devote an entire chapter on Belgian colonialism, which, if you like, was the before, but I began my analysis with the 1960s while making sure to gesture back and forth between the 1960s, the before, and the after. This mode of thinking or writing is called regressive approach, and it belongs to the historiography of processes as opposed to the historiography of origins. I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A session. My work on memory, trauma, and forgetting, which appear in Cahiers d'études africaines in 2019, is an example of both this approach to history, but also the way in which the shadows and echoes of the past I have just mentioned manifest themselves in the present. What I would like to say is that various patterns that constitute the basis of analysis in my work can't simply be dismissed. They constantly come up and they are prefigured in the present. So the work I did for my PhD also led me, as part of my postdoc at Stellenbosch University, to reflect on the long arc of boiling over of crises, but also how, as they melt and solidify, they leave resonances. Some of these patterns are empirical. For example, the way that people panic and get organized around extremes rather than relativistic forms of thinking, the way that violence comes to the surface and leads to greater anxiety, the way that mistrust and xenophobia blame come to the surface, the way that people begin to believe conspiracies and look for a scapegoat. These are patterns that Hannah Arendt described both in The Origins of Totalitarianism and The Human Condition. These are also patterns that French thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Michel Foucault, to name just these two, have described respectively in reflections on the Jewish question, and society must be defended. Finally, these are patterns that Achille Mbembe and scholars in a Fanonian tradition have also described. And this kind of pattern thinking can be a resource if we think critically. In time of contemporary crisis, historians and others can say, well, let's look for patterns in other periods, not in order to do a simple-minded or instrumental prediction, like in near prediction studies or prophecies, because as we all know, historians are not prophets, but instead to say, this is why we need to open up this set of crisis discourses. We need to open them up, we need to weight them, we need to reflect on them, we need to look for critical and philosophical engagement. This, I believe, is a way in which history could be useful at moments of crisis, such as those that we are currently experiencing. Now, why all these four needs I have just mentioned? They need to open them up, they need to weight them, they need to reflect on them, and they need to look for critical and philosophical engagement. It is because, as a discipline, history is different from memory. And because it is different from memory, history can't simply be reduced to a tool from which one can draw lessons. It should rather be approached, to use Paul Kramer's words, as that which can disrupt the inevitabilities and turn givens into problems while digging out lost alternatives and widening the horizons of empathy. Guillaume Lachenal's article, When History Has No Lessons, is interesting in this regard. The piece appeared in public seminar in April last year as part of the World Health Organization feature on apocalypse then and now. In this piece, Lachenal, a historian of science and medicine, argues that an over-reliance on the allure of pandemic precedent needs to be replaced with an enhanced understanding of the capacity of present crisis to resist historical interpretation. So there are three major ideas in Lachenal's assertion. First, the contingency of action, meaning indetermination is part of human history. Second, the singularity of the present, that is, one should always take into account the singularity of each situation. Lastly, comparison as an approach is useful in demonstrating the relationship between the past and the present, but this approach must always take context into account. This opens up a whole set of debate about the status of repetition in history. As historians, how should we approach the question of repetition in history? Should we approach it in Nietzschean sense, meaning the eternal return of the same, or in Deleuze's conceptualization of difference and repetition? According to Deleuze and his concept of difference, there is no identity, and in repetition, nothing is ever the same. Rather, there is only difference. Copies are something new, everything is constantly changing, and reality is a becoming, not a being. A piece I can think of among historians of Africa who grapple with this question of repetition methodologically is that of Nancy Rose Hunt on rape and repetition in Congo. She argues for the importance of rewriting the conventional atrocity narrative about violence in King Leopold's Congo Free State in relation to the present, the ongoing war violence related to humanitarianism and sexual violence in the DRC. In her own words, the work of strategically tethering the past to the present should not be about forging historicist links across time, but about locating repetitions and difference, including differences among humanitarian modes and strategies in the early 20th and the early 21st centuries. This approach, I believe, could be useful to historians of gender and sexuality. Now, what about the future framed in terms of hope? Or to quote part of the assignment that my colleague Melike has just given us, the contribution of history to charting out a different, more hopeful future. I should say from the outset that it is possible to think and write about the future in history. This is the domain of the subfield of history called prospective. Eric Osborne could be a perfect example. His writings in social and economic history were animated by the belief in the political and moral necessity of an alternative to the catastrophe of capitalism, which, according to him, was the systemic cause behind the rise of fascism in the 1930s. His work pioneered critical approaches of the study of the past, spurred by the crisis of his time. Today is 1994 prediction of our world of endless war, enormous inequalities, looming environmental disasters, and other ruins of neoliberalism in the epilogue of The Age of Extremes. His history of the 20th century appears prescient. But we shouldn't forget that, as I mentioned earlier, historians are not prophets. For us, by us I mean historians, to reflect on or write about the future, we rely on the relationship between the past and the present, which I have just described. My article on scars and marked bodies in the Journal of African History deal with this question of future, or better, future past, to use Renard Kozelek's vocabulary. The article is an example of how, methodologically and conceptually, historians can think of the relationship between, on the one hand, scars and marked bodies, and on the other hand, the arresting of time and the annihilation of future time. The future in my work is thought in terms of possibilities, and time more broadly in terms of multiple temporalities rather than chronologically or theologically. So considering all this, I would like to suggest that we address the question of hope for a better future in terms of possibilities. The reason I'm suggesting this is because history as a discipline and method demonstrate that there's always a range of possibilities for the future. When other disciplines believe in a kind of circular logics, that certain things will materialize based on a set of conditions. Here, I'm particularly referring to economics. History demonstrates that that's never quite true. No process is ever linear, and that ruptures, knowable and unknowable, are always defining features of event history. These historical processes are precisely what historians seek to uncover or imagine as being possible based on a deeply fragmented archive. Two examples I can think of to illustrate this idea of future as a set of possibilities are the Second World War and the financial crisis of 1973. As Frederick Cooper shows in East Africa since 1940, both crises led to a set of reforms in Africa more broadly and in Central Africa in particular. After the Second World War, the Belgians initiated a set of reforms in their colony of Belgian Congo, but also in Rwanda and Burundi, with the idea that, and this was their hope in 1946, that these reforms would allow them to continue to rule over their colonies for at least 40 to 50 years from the end of the war. But history tells us that that was never the case. Belgian Congo became independent in 1960 and Rwanda and Burundi in 1962. The financial crisis of 1973 led to a set of reforms known as structural adjustment programs in Africa in the 1980s, with the hope that they would trigger the development of Africa. We all know that that was never the case. So the future as a set of possibilities is very important. I don't have time to explore the climate crisis in details. I'm happy to come back to it in the Q&A session. But I would like to say that the climate crisis, or the Anthropocene, as Achille Mbembe and Gabriel Eck and many others have described it, has been coming for quite a long time. It has been coming since the Industrial Revolution. And we are now in a period when there is a rising temperature, rainfall patterns changing, oxygen level changing, and of course, the movement of viruses from the animal kingdom to human beings, and the ways in which these viruses move so rapidly through the world, through aeroplane travels and through the food production economy. So the climate crisis has a temporality that goes back at least 250 years, but it seems to be speeding up now. The problems are speeding up. And so this is perhaps a very interesting thing to think about as historians, whereas a pandemic is a particular subset of that, because pandemic viruses are often those that move between animals and human kingdoms. And what makes them a pandemic is that they become rapidly global. In the past, something like the Black Death or syphilis or another infection disease would take maybe 20, 50, or 100 years to spread to different corners of the globe. But now it can happen in a matter of 2 days. And so the temporality of crisis is fascinating when talking about biological and climate events. But then when we think of something like Black Lives Matter, or Roads Must Fall, or Fees Must Fall, which is closely tied to Black Lives Matter, we realize that it has an episodic quality. There is something particular to Vet University, to UCT or South Africa, and there's also something particular to Oxford University in the UK, but it's spread across the world through social media and through other vectors. And it gets to link itself to things that are not exactly the same, but things that can speak to each other. Things like protests about statues in the US, which then lead to the police violence. And people can see that it is connected to things that existed before. In my work on the Mulele Rebellion as crisis, I try to think of complex issues such as these ones in a relationship of entanglement, a concept I borrowed from Sarah Nuttall. According to Nuttall, entanglement is a condition of being twisted together or entwined or involved with. These conditions, she suggests, works with both difference and sameness, but also with their limits, their predicament. I am aware that there is a huge philosophical body of knowledge out there that include French philosophy, decolonization thinking, very important work from and after the Second World War that we are still drawing on and which I have found very important, like the work of Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, Ernest Bloch, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Georges Bataille, Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Achille Mbembe, and so forth. So surely as historians, we can mobilize these interesting forms of critical thinking now to think about history, but we need to be careful of collapsing this slow and careful work into non-critical use of words like crisis, which comes, at least it is a current exception, from journalism and very urgent political discourses. So it's fine for journalists to use that language, but history, the discipline that we are in, or at least I am in, and which is philosophical, ethnographic, and archival, cannot make everything looks like it is exactly the same as everything else, because in doing so, we lose some of the specificities that we have to offer on a careful, slow contextual thinking. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emery. I want to thank you for your enthusiastic thoughts and indeed your hopeful insights. I found them to be quite hopeful amidst all these crises we're experiencing. Yeah, you squeezed in so much in this short period of time. I think there's a lot to discuss there, but I think let's go to our next panelist right now, who is Shaheed Tayob. So Shaheed is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Stellenbosch University. Shaheed's research is primarily focused on the anthropology of Islam, with a focus on food practices and human-animal relations at the intersection of religion, politics, and economy in India and South Africa. Recent publications include 2 articles in a book chapter on the neoliberal transformation of halal in South Africa, and a consideration of the ethics and politics of slaughter, order, and infrastructural neglect in Mumbai, entitled Disgust as Embodied Critique, Being Middle Class and Muslim in Mumbai. Shaheed, it's really wonderful to have you join us for this webinar today. You're a familiar face with us at Historical Trauma. It's always nice to have you join our reading group discussions. And we look forward to you sharing your wisdom today on a broader platform. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for the generous introduction. And I must thank both Melika and Emery for the invitation, which was quite daunting. It's not often that when someone is so early in the career, they are forced to think about big questions. But and you'll see, I'll show you. As I speak about it, I'm going to link it back to my own work on meat, on the ethics and politics of meat in Mumbai, and some contemporary developments around COVID. So my paper, I've entitled it "Crisis, Quality, and the Everyday: Anthropology After Otherness." Anthropology situates itself as a discipline uniquely attentive to minute, intimate, and everyday moments that constitute life. Against the crass generalizations and quick assumptions that often categorize public political life, anthropologists present a corrective by focusing attention on the perspectives often concealed by a bird's eye view of the world. Against exclusionary politics, anthropologists show the complexity of those excluded. Against widely held assumptions of value, anthropologists show alternative ways of living. And against homogeneous expectations of human nature, or a universal way of life or universal culture, anthropologists train their attention on how others live. Close attention to everyday life and embodied practice is therefore inseparable from notions of alterity as a concern for others, for difference, for inequality and diversity. Hidden in this concern with otherness, difference, and diversity is very often an assumption of radical alterity, premised on a meta-material narrative of culture, a creative realm of meaning-making that overlays onto the brute reality of the physical and material world. There is one world and one material reality, yet many ways of apprehending the very same reality. This is I'm arguing, a dominant trope. Culture is then the complex way in which others make sense about what we know is in fact the same, right? We meaning reason, science, modern rationality. For example, they say death happens, but different cultures have different ways of imagining what death is. Or they say people eat, but different cultures have different ways of doing it and imagining the relation of eating to the body and to community. So the term imaginary captures this extra material sensibility of what it means to live in the world. Both productive and limiting. I hopefully managed to capture in that short statement. Productive because the world is always, the world is irreducibly full of difference, but limiting particularly because of the way that the real sneaks its way in, or a dominant kind of concern. So the dominant mode of considering of otherness and difference therefore often sneaks in a dominant assumption of the real as a scientific rationality overlaid with human and meaning-making realm of culture as either a system or a way of life. No matter that culture is now understood as dynamic, changing, and complex, these hidden assumptions remain on the surface of many anthropological texts. Now, this way of conceptualizing plurality is deeply rooted in liberal conceptions of respect and tolerance that recognize the value of difference in and of itself, as if difference is a value, not just simply a fact of the world. But importantly, as something out there, not in here. As long as modern, developed, Western, enlightened, or rational ways of life are secure, then difference is sequestered and neutralized. Now, I argue that the shift from otherness or difference as empirical observation, as a fact of the human phenomenon, or the world as a phenomenon beyond the human, of course, no. Right? So the shift from empirical observation to geographical location, meaning here and there, or to a subject position, us and them, we and they, is integral to the very operation of dominant modes of anthropological reason. So I'm trying to make a link here to say that this concern with difference or the other as an empirical observation, right, necessarily in a particular kind of epistemological way very easily leads to a geography of here and there, of us and them, and which are very, very, which one finds on the surface of anthropological texts all the time. The very concern with difference is continuously articulated as the attention to the immeasurable complexity of the world that we must understand, we must respect, we must consider. Yet, as critical scholars have noted, the archive of European experience, ideology, and hegemony is in this work very often left untouched. Instead, we have a reproduction and a reinsertion of what Mudimbe calls the history of the same, right? A way in which empirics from different parts of the world, different contexts, are all brought back into a general archive of expectation. And I think here, this is where Emery is picking up of historical development of cultures, a kind of a trajectory, right? And then very often an assessment, a measure, or an alterity, but always in relation to the history of the same, with a capital S, from Mudimbe, somebody we must all read. Or as Vina Das explained, to quote, the exotic other was not encountered accidentally, right, as if an empirical fact, but it was sought out as the opposite of the self. Or Michel Ralph-Triot, who explained very clearly that anthropology did not invent the exotic other, but actually disciplines it, an Enlightenment desire to know the world, to know the other, to know the exotic. And this goes back to the travel writings and all this, which are the beginnings of anthropology. For as Triot has so brilliantly outlined, the anthropological attention to detail, complexity in everyday life is constantly interpreted, situated, and and submitted to abstract forms of ideology and reason that reflect North Atlantic concerns. So savage anthropology was concerned with showing that the primitives are human too, really questioning why this was ever in doubt. And modernization theory, for so long touted as the antidote to a politics and epistemology of otherness, and still, social change and these kind of models which are still prevalent, is the celebration that the native is becoming like us, never questioning the stability of the enunciating subject, who is this us that we're talking about? And very importantly, actually, what Magobane has shown, what Bernard Magobane has shown, completely ignoring the political economy of oppression and the society in South Africa, for example, in the specific way in which social change becomes modernization theory. So banal obsessions with native dress and technology use continue to harbor fundamental assumptions that change, technology, and thought are somehow foreign to North Atlantic others, right? The discovery that the native is changing or that technology is coming into culture is itself premised on the idea that these are separate, distinct fields. Now, for example, the recent post-2000s discovery of Islamic capitalism in the anthropology of Islam is positioned as the revelation that Islam and capitalism are not fundamentally opposed. Right? Now, in this work, which thankfully is slowly becoming undone, the ideology of opposition or compatibility that fuels the inquiry is left unscathed. Right? It is a representation to the same order. And in this mode of research and knowledge production, the history of the same that Mudimba excavated, the North Atlantic hegemony that Tayob speaks about so clearly, and the epistemology of the real, either in material or cultural terms, is left undisturbed. So the challenge, therefore, for a decolonial anthropology, the buzzword we keep on using, but have wildly divergent ideas of what it is to engage in an epistemological debate, not just with abstract ideas of us or them, but with the very epistemological foundations of anthropology as a discipline. And who is the enunciating subject? Where does it emerge from? What are the kinds of what is the relation between empiricism and concept, and a host of others we can probably unpack, but I think Emery has touched on. So a challenge that will unsettle, right? I mean, a future for an anthropology must be, I argue, to say, that will unsettle the awkward, presumptive, and sometimes preposterous, and actually just downright racist assumptions that continue to mark the field, right? Of sneaking in languages of difference, of the real. Okay. So that's my challenge to a question of anthropology as method. Now, the next session is COVID, viral material ontologies. How many minutes do I have left, Malika? Did I take too long? I don't know. 10. Oh, great. So the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most significant universal challenges of the current generation, or our life right now. Not even generation, just the moment. Wars, ideologies, epistemology. The terrains of conflict and opposition that make the debates discussed about possible, right? Because the whole discussion is about questions of knowledge and power, state formation, right? So these are fundamentally ideologies of difference, of opposition. But viral contagion introduces a brute universality of the body, a regime of risk, which Ulrich Beck spoke about 30 years ago, that involves complex global flows of people, capital, goods, and expertise. Despite completing claims around viral spread, viral existence, whether they even exist, and vaccine efficacy, informed opinion is increasingly turning on the material and the universal as an urgent concern to challenge misinformation, disinformation, apathy, but also the tyrannies of viral inequality, vaccine apartheid as it was called, that bring to view the very obvious ways of difference, inequality, and the complexity, but through a material kind of lens. Indeed, the suspicions and denialism of elite critical philosophers like Agamben, who in their writings on COVID wrap around from radical left to alt-right, invigorate calls for an anthropology and philosophy and history of the universal, now through attention to microbes, viral movements, biology. And of course, this has been there before. The material turn, post-humanist turn, have already been discussing this. Itself also a form of universalism, I think, a new universalism. While I agree that the material is crucial as ever in understanding the world as we know it or seek to know it, the risk of a brute materialism is the reinsertion of a new universal, a new equalizer, a new kind of realism. And this is one of the critiques actually of some of posthumanism, right? A neo-realism. Now, how do we think about materiality without reintroducing this history of the same, except now, which I think continues to partake if we think about the ideologies of science? The question is then is what role does anthropology now play? What about epistemology, lives, lifestyles, and livelihoods? So in the rest of my paper, I'm now going to, I just putting that out there, but now I want to just discuss something a bit more concrete. And that is, so the semiotics of sanitation and a capitalist economy of mass production. Okay, so my work is, I did research on Muslim food practices in Mumbai. I spent a year in Mumbai, basically looking at different locations where for a Muslim food practice broadly, right? So I looked at Muslim butcher shops, Muslim restaurants. I spent a lot of time with ordinary people, just enjoying the city, hanging out, talking. I considered both religious rituals like halal, but also economic change and the exclusionary and right-wing, very hostile right-wing political context. And one of the things that was interesting was this particular butcher shop. In fact, one of the first places I came, I still remember the very first day I was in the city. I happened to walk down and I met these two brothers. They were so friendly. They were happy to meet me. I didn't know a word of Hindi. I didn't know anything. And they took me on this wonderful ride. They introduced me literally to the networks through which meat in the city is provided. How do people eat? How does meat get to the restaurant, to the plate? And how it happens in Mumbai, interestingly, is that, and like much of the global south, you have networks of traders that bring live animals into the city, mainly chickens. I'm focusing on chicken and sometimes goats. And these animals, so if you go to a butcher shop, you see there are some live chickens. You can choose the one you want, they weigh it. It then gets slaughtered in front of you. And by the time the packet arrives, there's a warm packet. You feel the heat of this animal literally between 2-3 minutes, you know, that has just been handed over to you. But the butcher shop, these two brothers, Hafiz and, was also stocked frozen chicken, right? So they also, not really frozen, it's actually refrigerated. But in Mumbai, people just refer to it as frozen chicken because it's in the refrigerator and because it's cold. So this chicken is mass produced on the outskirts of the city, large corporate owned, massive industrially sanitized slaughterhouses, built according to these ISO standards, global standards. And they are far outside of town, 20 or 30 kilometers away. Stuff is slaughtered, cleaned, packed into sanitized packaging, and supplied through vast networks of butchers and local shops in the city. So immediately, this was an interesting thing that I always, as I would sit with Hafiz at his shop, it was always something going on, something that interested me. This new economy is coming in. It's disrupting his business. He still sells it because he has to. But interestingly, right, he sells it because he has to, you're stocking him, but he was always against it. There was something about this which was a problem. And I realized very quickly that the problem is that he makes, it's partly a business decision. So on one level, if he slaughters the chicken in a shop, he's doing the whole process. He makes more than if he has to buy a ready product. But there's another question, and that's the kind of business relations and the networks, perhaps the entanglements. The relation he has between the corporate mass producer, who is incidentally 49% owned by Tyson Meats, which is the largest American producer of chicken in the world. So it shows you are entering flows of global capital, is that the relations of debt that he can get with that are very different to what he gets from the live chicken supply. The live chicken supply has been supplying his father since the 1950s. Okay, they may have changed at some point, but there are long networks of relationships developed. And when he's in trouble, he'll still get his chicken and he can pay in a few days, right? So there's a question of debt and relation, right? So I mean, Emery speaks of entanglement. I think with this question of relation we get from Glissant was extremely important. So there are relations there, and those relations are stopped, right? The capitalists forms of debt with the corporate, right, blocks relations in favor of a document. Can you prove that you have money? Do you not? Not, oh no, I know you, don't worry, you're okay, right? And then the other thing is, and the most important, not most, but another important part, right, is that besides, what did I mention now? Oh yeah, his business profit, his debt. Then the other part is that the politics, the anti-Muslim politics of Hindutva, right? So what happened is, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, there has been a very powerful, virulent form of right-wing Hindu nationalism, which is now in charge of the state, which has as its discourse, right, the idea of the purity of the Hindu nation and the sacrifice almost of the Muslim, right? And in the imaginary, the Muslim is stopping Hindu nation from being who it is. Why? Because according to the idea, Hindus are inherently peaceful, loving people who live by ahimsa, and Muslims are violent conquerors who slaughter meat and eat meat. They are like butchers. Now, this imaginary, this imagery, right, of the Muslim as butcher is a very powerful imagery that circulates in Hindu circles, and it basically authorizes violence against Muslims. If you're familiar with what's happening, there's constantly sometimes large massacres against Muslims where 1,000, 2,000 people are killed every 10 years for the last while and more. And there are also increasingly very small lynchings where individuals are just caught on suspicion of eating meat. So there's this idea of the abject, right? The Muslim is not really fit, and the imagery in the discourse is the Muslim as butcher. So for someone like Hassan, he is the butcher, right? So his very livelihood, right, is that site of potential, political unrest, the potential disgust. So what happens here is that immediately we start to see that actually this, what they call a neoliberal economy, which is actually not very liberal at all. It's actually an economy of purity, an economy of getting rid of the poor, getting rid of the unworthy, and in India, getting rid of the Muslims, right? Sanitizing. So in that sense, this is the situation in which this happened. But interestingly, while I was doing this field work from 2012, 2014, his market was only like 20%, right, for this frozen chicken. So he was quite fine. People trusted him. There were relations of trust, relations of debt with him and his customers, generational relationships. So he had his system, and he was pretty much constantly trying to reduce the demand for that chicken. But then when I met him in 2016, what happened was, it turns out that a local newspaper, so there was already suspicion there about this chicken. Why is it so cold? Why is it ready produced? Where's the animal? Right? So there's a whole different kind of sensory politics or sensory ethics around meat consumption, where the packaged product is the thing that's suspicious in Mumbai. That's why it was only 20% of the market. But then along comes an article in a local newspaper about antibiotic use in and brining and technology in factory-produced chicken. And suddenly, in the small community, people stopped demanding the chicken. So he stopped selling the frozen chicken altogether. And for him, this was like a victory. Thank God they finally realized, even though he himself knew that, it's the same chicken. He knows that the chicken is the same from it's from a factory. So anyway, he left that aside and carried on. I spoke to him about 3 weeks ago or a month ago. I can't remember now. It was a bit before Emery presented this challenge. And then he explained to me another story. He was like, COVID came. First, there was a lockdown. The chicken shop could stay open. So he got a special permit. Everything was fine. More or less, he was delivering chicken in the area. But what happened was that, according to him, people want sanitized stuff now. He's like, COVID make them demand sanitation. So the emphasis on sanitizing hands and surfaces in the kind of COVID public discourse, right, about protecting yourself against the virus, had now led to an increasing demand for frozen chicken. Now, to understand this, one needs to think about qualia, right? The qualities of things, right? So there are materials, subjects in the world, but there are also quality which we ascribe to the thing, right? So qualities are not, as much as they are attached to a material, they are not exactly the same thing as the material. A quality is felt as if it is immediate, as if it is, real. But on closer analysis, we know that the quality is something we attribute, we invest in the thing. When we say we have a warm feeling at home, we are not literally warm because we are with our family, but we link the feeling of love, familiarity, and relaxation with warmth. This is an example of what Nicholas Harkness calls qualic transitivity. So when, to use his very complicated language, he talks about how when qualities jump across different domains. Let's just leave it there. So he asks, how is it that people make these links, or he would ask, right, between the warmth of the sun, right, a summer's day of feeling literally warm, and then being with family on a familiar space where you go. And this is the question of material semiotics, to study the way that qualities transfer across different. So back to our case, the other case is the quality of sanitation, sanitizing, right? The threat of the lurking virus that led to this demand for sanitized packaged meat. So contrary to expectations of development or the inevitability of capitalist forms of consumption, or modern forms or developed forms, or whatever terms you want to use for these forms, it is only now with COVID that the demand for this kind of product has come up. So the question is, will this remain? Will the end of the lockdown change this? Or are these shifts permanent? And what is this political economy of sanitation and purity in a world with so-called neoliberal ideology, which is actually not very liberal at all? And thank you, this has given me a possibility. We need to actually think about this. What kind of misnomers are being used in naming neoliberal, which is actually a discourse of purity? Is creating a world of sanitized spaces for the super rich, of consumer enclaves, of gated communities. So anthropology can train our attention on these developments, recognizing the specificity of place, people, religion, practice, without falling into the traps and tropes of otherness and the history of the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaheed, for your very colorful contribution as always. Again, lots to contemplate there and all the interesting connections you drew for us. I just want to remind the audience to please post your questions already. If something comes up for you, feel free to post your questions already in the Q&A function. Okay, so now we are going to go to our respondent, which it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mosa Phadi to you, who is, I'm sure, familiar to many of you, and she's also a recent colleague of us here at Historical Trauma and Transformation. So Mosa is now a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of the Free State. In 2018, she was awarded the American Council for Learned Societies African Humanities Program postdoctoral fellowship. She co-authored 2 groundbreaking reports on the local municipalities of Mogalakwena and Lephalale. She has worked as a researcher for over 8 years, published several peer-reviewed works, and produced a research documentary film focusing on the middle class in Soweto. Additionally, Mosa was the co-editor of the 2016 NHISS Best Nonfiction book entitled Class in Soweto. Her research interests include Du Bois, Marxism, Blackness, and class. So Mosa is now going to respond to our panelists. Mosa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melika, and thanks, Emery, for the invitation. It's a very daunting task, because it's opening up a world, and I was trying to think how to make it a bit more distilled. But what I can draw from as a starting point, what I can draw from what I've heard, is thinking through a set of ideas, how ideas get created, how ideas are defined, produced, reproduced. And also it's opening up a space of not knowing. And I think also what is happening with the pandemic, it's that space of not knowing and understanding things as they unfold. And I think that's where I come in, I guess, as a sociologist, not only who theorize as events unfold, but also who's trying to draw from the past and also relate it to the present. But also in one level, I think also Shaheed's work speaks at the center of it, how people actually theorize their own work. Actually, the people that we speak to, how do they see their own world? How do they theorize the everyday that they actually exist in? The world as it changes, the world as it moves. What does it actually mean for them? And that is theory in its own. And I think that's where, sociologists come to the fore. But I think Let me start with some of the provocations that Emery mentioned. And Melika, please do stop me in the middle if I go into a rant and then I'm over time. So he starts with this provocation. We need to be careful of collapsing these slow, careful work into a non-critical use of the word like crisis, which comes from journalists in a very agent political discourse. And it drew me to what has happened recently in both in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng. And the government uses the word insurrection. That's the word that was used. And I think there's something about that idea in its own that reflects the factional politics of the ruling party or the ruling class, actually, not even the ruling party itself, and its inability to remedy the problems that we are facing as a people, but across. But that's not the point. But I just, for the fact that I'm using that term, it's an idea. It's already in people's discourse. It's shaping how we actually analyze history, how we move from what actually happened, what event, what facts, what language we use in itself. So, you know, which comes from the government in itself. So even history has a language, even the everyday has a language, but also it's imposed this language. That's what I'm trying to say, because now we have to debate whether it was an insurrection or not. That's another interesting thing, but that's not the debate here. The debate in terms of like what happened in society. You know, what was interesting in Joburg, because I'm in Johannesburg at this moment, where when the uprising was happening, there was an issue around how the middle class and the elite responded. You know, I was driving around and everybody was in the radio, we need the military, or there were some solutions that everybody was giving, some analyst in some radio station or some television on how to deal with this matter. But what, you know, as you see and you hear the analysts go on about what needs to be resolved, you see the scenes of the poor, they call it, the so-called those who live in a township, looting in the malls. But actually, when you went to the suburbs where the elite and the middle class who were going on about this crisis and what it means, they were looting at Woolies and Checkers and buying toilet paper. There was no food. There was no toilet paper. I do think someone actually at a particular time has to write around the politics of toilet paper and the fear of the middle class and what it actually means in this crisis. And every time when we imagine a crisis, during the pandemic, I was in Stellenbosch, there was no tissue anyway, at some point, it was all left out. So it's thinking through these ideas and also how the Swart Gevaar idea now has become classed. It's no longer the middle class who happen to be like white only. It was everybody who was middle class in gated communities actually imagining that this violence that is done by the poor will come to them. And I'm sure the tissue, of course, naturally will save them as their house burn. So this is like the ideas around how ideas and history gets told. Because now we're sitting with understanding how the poor got to this point, but we're not understanding how the rich got to a point where Woolies can be emptied out. As we think about history and crisis, that we are all in a crisis of some sort, both the poor and the rich in one level. But that's another point, I think, in thinking about the philosophy around also history and the everyday. But also, I'm starting from a premise, I think, as a scholar, that capitalism has always been in crisis. And it's from the very inception of capitalism, it's a process of crisis. And that brings out different questions. So you don't get surprised when there's various crises that happens in the system that actually exist. But also, I think it forces us then to say we're not surprised about what these crises in different forms, but also is to analyze the context, the ruptures, and the unknown within that context, how it mutates Because within that, one of the beauties of how capitalism survived and still survives is because it has a way of mutating to the current demands and adapting to the current demands. And that's how it has emerged. It assimilates, it reforms itself, but still produces the same crisis. And what is the same crisis? We are living in an unequal world where the poor, as Shaheed has said, are wiped out one way or the other, consistently throughout history. And that is a historical fact. So, and there's been a lot, and that's another point. There's been reference, for example, around the climate change, you know? And I think people who know me personally, they know I'm an advocate for plastic straws in life, primarily because it's ironic around the paper straw struggle. And what is the ironicness around it? Is that now with the solutions, because I'm getting to the idea of like how knowledge and history gets produced, but also the ironies of how the solutions that were given are still very much embedded in capitalism and neoliberal thinking. And this has been happening for the last 40 years, that we haven't actually, as a people and scholars, ruptured this idea. So let me go to this climate change. We've been told solar panels are the solution for renewable energy. Okay, yeah. We've been told lithium batteries are the solution to this renewable energy. But what I don't tell you when I give you the solutions is actually what does it take, the manufacturing processes that takes to build a solar panel that are toxic and exploit the working class and the labor condition that comes with that. What they don't tell you when they put your lithium battery and you feel you're like, this is renewable energy and you're saving the planet, is actually has created a growing mining boom that actually mines this lithium. So there's a contradiction in terms of what we actually situate our knowledge to. That actually what at the essence of the solutions that we bring is actually not telling people that we cannot consume the way we've always did. Building more solar panels is not the solution if actually it's going to still destroy the earth and it's going to create crises like what has happened at this moment. That consumption, capitalism, the way it operates at the core of it, and consume as usual, just because you're getting an electrical car doesn't make it better. There's like, I mean, in the whole process of it. And this is the knowledge that you actually been fed through this neoliberal ideas, because you can disown that actually to get lithium batteries, you need diesel to ship it out with a ship that actually is gonna pollute the sea. You ignore certain questions in this production of knowledge and this production of history and the everyday, that actually what does it take to do all these things? And this idea has been, you know, for the last 40 years of neoliberal ideas, because neoliberal ideas come with consumption, come with individualism, and also has changed, you know, at level, how even universities work, because now we actually have students who are consumers that rate us in terms of like the content that they receive and whether it's suitable for their needs or not. But this is where, again, we have to ask ourselves, with this 40 years of neoliberal knowledge, how has history been analyzed, interpreted? How has this disciplined? That actually now we're forced in some levels, some even scholars have become actually corporate consultancies and so on, that actually some of the research that we're doing has actually come to be part of the corporate inclusion in it, which is fine. But actually we have to ask, where's the discipline? What methodology? Who are we speaking for? Who are we writing for? And for what purpose? In the last 40 years, including our own interpretation of history. But I want to come back. These are like points, so in terms of those things, but also it goes back to the core of what Shaheed has said. How do we actually, in scholarship, produce history that is not the same, that is not othering? And the question when he mentioned is like, how can we? How can we when anthropology, history, sociology has been complicit in othering, i.e. the history that we know has been racialized, gender erased certain people, and also, what is it? It's basically embedded in racism, class, and gender erasure in one level. This is the history of anthropology, the history of sociology in many ways. And I think this is where scholars, not only Du Bois being at the core of it and people following from that tradition, rewriting the history. And he does it in a book called Reconstruction, where in the Reconstruction, he says, he notes, I would say, this book seeks to tell and interpret the 20 years, which is, he was writing at the time, the 1860 to 1880, of the fatal history with special reference to the efforts and experiences of the Negro. Because what happens with history that is racist, that erases gender, that is classed as well, because particular elites become more prominent than others. The working class becomes a footnote in terms of making the history, as we know. It's like, how do we insert again the correct history of people that actually they were part of the process of creating democracy in the world? They were thinking subjects. They were not inferior, and they actually were important. And I think what he does so beautifully, and so Placky has done this in his appeal as well to the empire in One Level in Native Life, is actually, even though it was an appeal to the empire, to the British Empire, was also to disrupt what has been written about Black history and its role in the Republic, and what has been done as well in wiping how white people have wiped out that history, and what the consequences of oppression for Blackness has done in terms of like not only the law, the land, sense of identity, recognition, and also history that is actually not been told. Because when you think about the Republic, you think of the Boer War in many levels, and some historians still teach this, but actually don't actually teach the role that actually Black people have played in thinking around these questions and actually inserting them into history. And I think what Du Bois does, not only methodologically, but it's also challenging the references and the scholarship in that regard. And I think it's a challenge in one level. I don't have questions, maybe I do have questions, I'm not sure. That, you know, and I want to focus on the last 40 years, because the last 40 years, the idea even of a university has changed. How we produce knowledge in various ways has changed. And what is demanded of us as scholars from various vantage points of like discipline has changed. Is, you know, how has this shaped, and I'll put it back, how has this shaped the scholarship and the knowledge in terms of anthropology, in terms of like history in itself? And also I think, you know, even though I think in many ways, the pandemic has concretized some of the things that have been happening for the last 40 years, there's an issue around methodology, because what the pandemic has done is like actually has changed even how we actually read, go back to the subject, you know, for anthropologists, for sociologists. How do we actually do the methodology? How do we actually think about research and speaking to the people in different ways? So what is the methodology that we, you know, how has the pandemic has changed the methodology in itself of research? And also, what are the questions? What are the key questions that we're trying to answer in this current era? What is hidden as well as we try to answer the key questions, whatever the key questions are? You know, I'm going back to Alex Neville Alexander, the national question, you know, these ideas of what gets hidden, what gets untold, you know, and I'm saying this because I'm closing up now, but I want to say this. I was driving, the Free State is very interesting. I work there. So occasionally I do my own sociological tours there. And what is interesting about these places is like actually there are places where 1994 never happened. Literally, there are people where 1994 never happened. There are towns where literally people are forgotten. And no one is writing about this. Why? What are the hidden questions that we're not asking about our society? As we rewrite, as we question these methodologies, as we question history. And who are we forgetting in the scholarship as well? So I'll leave it there. I think, yeah, so these are my provocations.
Thank you very much, Mosa. I'm going to give the panelists the opportunity to respond now. So let's start with Emery and then with Shaheed. So I just want to give you the opportunity to have a little bit of a conversation amongst yourselves. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Melike. Thank you, Mosa and Shaheed for your wonderful contribution. So I mean, all the responses from Mosa, I think they were really great. So I don't necessarily have a particular comment to make in regard to what Mosa said.
Shaheed, would you like to comment on any aspect of the discussion?
Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Mosa, for your reflections, which are obviously, I mean, they are conceptually and philosophically interesting, but also you situated them for us, in our history. And I think that stood out for me was the way you, center the question of consumption, the way that, consumption is not questioned in this critique, you mentioned about kind of alternative energy. So you potentially are opening out the space to think about the question of ethics, where ethics is often thought of, I mean, in a very simplistic way, yeah, it's ethical to have renewable energy. But the ethics as it relates to the question of the self and how we live and what we do obviously demands something more. And I hear you kind of drawing that out. Something that really interests me, when do we just stop? Why can we not just stop consuming? And to relate, for example, to your observations during, during the protest, this is again a thing, this kind of, in Durban where I am right now, the fear was actually for everybody wanted white bread, the middle class. And this obsession with bread, and I found this the funniest thing. So obviously I, like all good middle class people, we ran and we bought our flour and stuff, but my idea was to buy flour because we can be good hipsters, like COVID, and start making bread at home if this thing carries on, right? It's another form of consumption. But they think that the reason we bought the flour also because we don't actually eat white bread, right? So the thing was, it's interesting how a commodity, which is actually a commodity of the working class, becomes a kind of a desire for the middle class. And I think you really opened us up to these questions of ethics, questions of how people situate themselves, and again, to take us to the to the everyday, to the minute, things that people do, their desires, their motives, their fears, their anxieties, but importantly, not just in and of themselves as perceptions or something like that, but really what they say about the society. And then, of course, the other point you picked out here was how can we produce a kind of knowledge? And I think this is, thank you for picking that up, but I think this is something, central to what we need to do, because And in my work, I try to address it through the use of categories or the suspension of category, because the category, right, is actually a judgment. And so we use categories often in the social sciences as if they are just things that explain the world, but they are judgments. And they involve very, very particular histories and assumptions and stuff. So I think we all need to read more Du Bois. Thank you.
Mosa, would you like to say anything at this point, or should we go to the questions?
I think go to the questions. I see there is a few, then yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we had two participants who were very engaged and interested in your presentations. So I'm first going to go to Vanessa's first question. She says, thanks for the considerations, Dr. Kalema. In reflecting on the relationship of history as a discipline with time, how does history think about crisis? Your talk is drawn on this. Please elaborate. Is crisis conceptualized and defined as crisis on the basis of the past, present, or future? Is crisis necessarily a breaking away or a metamorphosis of the existing? I mean, if time isn't conceptualized in a linear fashion, can crisis also break away from a linearity in conceptualization? Thanks. Okay, Emery, if you have any thoughts on that. Just switch off your mute, Emery.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, thanks Melike, and thanks Vanessa for this set of questions. I think so. Do we have to think in terms of past, present, future, or so that's one thing. And then the other thing is about crisis. If time is conceptualized in a linear fashion, can crisis also break away from a linearity in so that's basically the two things that I think is important. I think the webinar was designed in a specific way. So first, how different disciplines, so Mosa sociology, myself, historian, and Shaheed anthropologist, how this discipline can at least enable us to think about something, the role that it can play at least at this particular moment. So as a historian, I mean, there's or at least in history, or I mean, the way people, let's say ordinary people, think about history is that the past can tell us something about the present, and then that would at least help us, in French we say préparer, to prepare for the future. So that's the conception that that people have in general. So I think what I was trying to do here was that yes, there is something interesting that we can learn from the past, but that shouldn't necessarily lock us into a specific way of thinking, and then thinking about history as critique, which I was referring to from John Scott. So that's the first thing. And if we do that, then we don't necessarily going to lock ourselves into those prisms. So now in the idea of crisis itself, yes, there is always the notion of time. So if crisis starts now, crisis, I mean, it means everything in different disciplines. And Renard Kozelek, wrote the genealogy of crisis. So it will be interesting to look at that book. It's called, I think, Crisis and Critique. So crisis defined as a difficult or dangerous time in which a solution is needed. So at least that's in medical term. So now if we take that, a so first there's the moment when the crisis is happening, and then there's an expectation or a hope that at the end of this crisis, something different will come. So there's hope. And if you look at that way, it's also future oriented. So in that regard, it has this notion of time, this linearity, at least in terms of thinking. Now, analytically, how do you do that? So I think that's what I was trying to present here. So do we necessarily do things in a linear way? With coronavirus, at least, so we try this with the hope that tomorrow it's going to get better, but we realize that things are not necessarily going the way we expected. So then there's this notion of possibilities, that the future, yes, it's time oriented, but we can't keep into this linearity that there's this stage first, and then the next, and then the other one. So I think that's the way of complicating the way, this is one of the ways in which we can complicate this idea of time. So now, and of course, I can't pretend to speak for all historians, because among historians, there are also many, contradictions. And so that's also something that we have to acknowledge. But from my standpoint, at least how I think history conceptually or theoretically, if you like, this is how at least I see those things, that time shouldn't be always thought in a linear way, because the way we experience time is not necessarily linear. So as we are speaking now, I'm talking to you. At the same time, I might be thinking about other stuff, which also brings another dimension of temporality. So there is the instantaneity as things are happening, but also there's this movement backward in the past and also projection in the future. So I think that's how I understand that movement. So again, thank you for the wonderful question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Emery. Shaheed, I'm going to go to you. Esther asks, what makes your research anthropological rather than sociological? Is it because your methodology involves a kind of participant, observer, attention to the details of the everyday, the ebb and flow of life in a community? Yes. I was thinking there's another question for you.
I will do that.
You both.
Okay.
Vanessa also asks, perhaps you can comment a bit on how we can think more seriously about the notion of crisis in your field, and as understood by the people you study. So both of those kind of more methods questions or conceptual questions in your field.
Okay, thanks a lot. And what I also try to do is just address Esther, because I see there's a long list of questions. We probably don't have much time. Okay. Okay, now Esther, you're asking a fundamental question. What makes it? It's probably a bit of everything. I mean, I don't personally subscribe to these issues here, of anthropological sociology, history. I think the fact that we're here today, in fact, we got an anthropology, sociology historian, we all understand what we're saying. So the question, actually, I don't really, to be honest, I don't want to get into that categorization, I think what makes me an anthropologist is that I tend to read more anthropological literature. I find it more stimulating for me. It forced me into these kind of questions, which I wasn't being prompted to by sociology. But look, we've got Mosa here, and she's very, very critically engaged in sociology. So partly, I think you are quite right. Actually, maybe it's a question of method. I know for me, when I started with, say, like the sociology of religion, I'm very interested in speaking to people. I wasn't really interested in, just concepts in religion. I wanted to know what the people are doing, what's happening. And I guess from that point of what's happening, it was already very anthropological, going shopping with people, talking to them in their homes, meeting them in different places. And then it just kind of fell into place that, this is the method. And then one moves more away from direct questioning to, a more kind of, I think what Emery pointed out, a very slow kind of work. And I think what Emery speaks about in history is the slow work in the archive, the slow work of theory, and in anthropology and ethnography, it's the slow work of just being there and trying to learn about networks, connections, relations in the field. And partly, hopefully, I will touch on this again here with Vanessa's question. Vanessa, you asking how we think about the notion of crisis in the field as understood by the people, and how do they see their place within the moment? So for me, as much as that's very interesting, that question for me potentially limits the whole question once again, right? Because it's inserting the question of crisis into people's worldview to ask them how do they, perceive it. And for me, that is exactly that kind of order of, of interrogation, which I think we have to suspend. We can't ask, it's a leading thing. I'm not interested actually in how they think of their place within the crisis moment, because that is a series of second order conceptual things loaded into a question, how they think. So we presume they have a perspective, then it's within a moment, right? So presumably they have their own place, but then also at this moment of crisis. I propose that, and what I'm trying to do in my book is to suggest that actually when we do our work, we have to rather ask not about these abstract questions, right? Because as Emery suggested, crisis is both linear and circular, and it's, they're all different positions from which one, obtains a view of a crisis. So the question for me, and I can just give you a quick anecdote, so I did my field work with one of my interlocutors was this wonderful man, I call him Uncle, and he got a perfume store. It was like a really nice place to chill, you find out about the city and just relax about it. And he, again, by chance met him. But while he was there, he was very interested in food, telling stories about the cooking and how he cooks and all this kind of thing. But he always told me how he had this problem. His stomach has a problem. And his Amil, who's his advisor, kind of ethical advisor, told him, you must eat simple food. So he was practically vegetarian. But he knew how to make all the things, and this was his thing, stomach issue. 2017, I go back and I just went for a week, greeting everyone. And suddenly I'm sitting with him and he's chilling. And then out of the blue, he tells me, and this was after BJP, after the Hindu right wing have come into power, after there have been lynchings all over, very, very violent outcomes, in different parts of the country. A lot have been written on it. And then I'm sitting with him. And what did he tell me? He said, what I saw here? I look at him like, what do you mean? Like, what did you see? I'm thinking, because I'm speaking Urdu, I don't know if I'm catching it. Like, what do you see? He said, yeah, there. And he's pointing to his house. And he says, what I saw on the street? And then he says 92, 93, right? So in a way, the crisis of the right wing coming to power reactivated a certain kind of memory for him. And then he told me the story that actually his stomach problem was because when he had to keep his family safe and go into his home, he saw people getting lynched on the street. And I didn't then push him again what he saw and all this kind of. So the question of when you hold the category in suspension, we also need to ask, how are we asking questions? And when does our, when do we ask loaded questions? Because loaded questions will give you loaded answers. It's idealistic. So
Shaheed, we are quickly running out of time, but Mosa, the next one is for you. And this is something that also came up for me. Esther asks again, I really would like to know how COVID has changed research methodology. And then together with that, also Carla's question, do you think we can think about the insurrection or looting as a type of consumption? You have referred to the middle class, the immediate emergency mass consumption as a type of looting, if I understood correctly. Questions around desire here are very interesting to me. So if you could maybe answer both of those questions or respond to them.
For a very long time, around methodology, especially methodology that sort of situates the narrative of the poor, that speaks and goes to the grassroots, as they call it. And I'm using these inverted commas because that's been the debate. When I hear from the poor, when I hear from the grassroots, there's something very parochial, but also very problematic and exploitative around it. Because going to a certain space, you're choosing a site. You're going to that certain space to understand how the poor are thinking about whatever, X, Y, and Z. And I think for the first time, that idea it's been complicated, but I think it was in suspension. There was a moment where everybody had to sit still. Things were happening. We knew for sure, I mean, in various ways, what happened in COVID is like actually what I witnessed as I drove around during the lockdown and, in various ways was actually queues. You saw actually queues and queues of lines, especially amongst the working class and the poor, either getting food or whatever, like going to USave or whatever. It was a longer queue than actually ordering online if you're living in the suburbs and getting your food delivered, or actually working from home. This idea of working from home, which actually, when you think about it, outside the professional of like health, most people who are middle class sat at home, including the academy, sat at home. So what does it do when that relationship in terms of knowledge production that is always dependent on going to a site has been suspended, which was, how do we do research? And it was like a whole thing. Do we go back to surveys? Do we go back to, do we interview people online? Is it proper? How do we get access? What becomes sampling? What becomes in-depth interview? What becomes all these things? And I think for the first time in a different way, outside not only doing, as some people call it, poverty porn, we had to also think about the methodology. What do we do now? Because you cannot speak and go to that site. And I think it brought different questions. I don't have the answers yet. Also in terms of like, even for students and so on, when they have to do the field, what becomes ethical, what doesn't become ethical, all those questions we're spreading out. And I think we have to, as scholars, we have to start thinking hard and long around that in itself, because it doesn't no longer work in the same way. The site is problematic. And I was speaking from that perspective as well. And one of the things I did was to drive around really, and just to see where the mood was in different ways, restricted in one level, but also allowed to see the milieu as people organize, as people in the crisis, because it's not about the crisis. It's like, what do people do in the unknown? That is interesting. What do? You don't know. You know what I mean? There's a flood. What do you do in that moment? That's the most interesting thing. I think that's what social scientists should investigate. It's not asking whether there's a crisis. It's like, what do we do? You know what I mean? And I think that is quite important. And then, because it becomes a methodological issue, because then informs what type of questions you ask. So the issue around, and I'm trying also to problematize language, because language, when the insurrection happened, which is highly problematic, by the way, but there was the idea again of looting that came with it, and who becomes the looter? Because immediately when you say looting, in that moment, you thought the township, you thought Black and poor. That was the image. And sometimes when we write, even our knowledge production, when we write about the looter as a concept, it's sort of like demonize and actually vilify the working class as these people who do not think. They become the looters because they are the masses and their people. So, and then there's the rest of us. And this is where, again, around history and language, it's very important. And I was actually saying the looter was not only looting, as you saw the scenes on television, they running with some, flat TV or whatever else. There was some looting elsewhere that was purchased this time. that actually emptied out in a different site, emptied out Woolies, emptied out Checkers, that we don't think about them. And this is where the hidden in history becomes important. The hidden knowledge, the blind side of what we produce and what we actually retail. Because what happens with these things is scientific gossip. Knowledge becomes, you refer to this person because this person referred to it. Is it really true? As we produce, as we rewrite our histories. And this is where it's a philosophical question, but it's also an approach in terms of like methodology, ethics, and also in itself, the ontology around knowledge production and history and the everyday.
Thank you very much, Mosa. I think we've reached the end of our time. This was such a provocative webinar. I do want to just give each of you, if there's something that you want to say, I'm going to give you a last opportunity, but if everybody is happy, I'm going to close it off. Emery, Shaheed.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for addressing this relevant topic from your various perspectives and experiences. Thank you so much for your thoughts and insights. Before we close off, I want to remind the audience about our webinar next month in October, always on the second Wednesday of the month. So it will be on October the 13th. The title of that webinar is Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, Ex-Combatants' Voices in Transitioning from War to Peace. And I look forward to having many of you join us again for that webinar. So that's it from us for today. I hope you have a lovely afternoon and goodbye.